Hello, in this lesson we are going to look at some of the ways that you can challenge your inner food critic for good. So what is your inner food critic? I like to think of it as the inner voice, thought, or feeling that you experience when relating to food. And so where does this inner food critic come from? For most of us, this was developed over time from all the external inputs we gathered, learned, and absorbed as we grew up. It is a way for our brain to keep us safe and protected. And it is made up of the different thoughts, thought patterns, and repeated messages that we have. These external inputs come from a range of places like social media, advertising, the entertainment industry, family beliefs around food, diet culture, and trends among our social networks. Often it gives us a false sense of security because the brain is constantly scanning our environment for external inputs and translating them into programmed thoughts or memories to keep us safe. Over time, these programmed thoughts can become cognitive distortions where we believe that certain foods are bad for us, or we believe that we shouldn't be doing certain things. Every person's inner food critic can sound different and have a different voice, persona, or image. But the consistent thing about the inner food critic is that there is a theme of criticism, judgment, and doing something wrong. So it may sound like any of these things shown here. The interesting thing is that the research has often refuted these claims. So why do we still accept them? This is because every person's external input reinforces these messages. So whilst the input may vary, the reason why the inner food critic peaks can be from any of these things. To understand how to challenge our inner food critic, we need to see how it is triggered. Commonly, the judgment stems from one of these three areas. The first is mindset or psychology, where our thoughts about food, any beliefs or rules can lead to self-criticism or blame. The second is through our eating behaviors, where our routines, rituals, or habits, as well as eating preferences, can cause a trigger of judgment. The third is triggered by our perception and how we feel in our bodies, where the connection between hunger and fullness can affect how we behave and therefore feel about ourselves. This is also impacted by our own self-acceptance and body image. So the inner food critic can be triggered by any of these three areas, and some can be more specific to you. So how can we change the way that we think or react to these triggers? The answer is neuroplasticity. Now, I know I'm not a psychologist, but working in the eating disorder space has taught me a lot about how our brain affects our behaviors and vice versa. Neuroplasticity is a way for us to adapt our thinking by rewiring the brain and building new neural pathways. This means that we can change the patterns of our thoughts and ultimately our actions or response towards food, eating, and our bodies. Over time, our default thoughts can weaken as we learn a different way to approach situations around food and can come into acceptance or even let go of the inner critic voice. How we practice this is to venture down new thinking paths, and by practicing this over time, you would rewire the brain and build new neural pathways. How I like to think of it is like a hiking trail. At first, it's overgrown with things in the way and not a clearly defined trail, but over time, as we continue to walk that path, it becomes more pronounced and easier. The ways to start building new neural pathways include creating boundaries. If your inner food critic peaks at a particular time or when you are at a social event, you could try to reaffirm yourself that you are safe. The voice is playing its natural role, but you do not need to listen to it. Or you could acknowledge it and give yourself a pause to process the thought before letting it go and saying goodbye. The second is to challenge criticism. If your inner food critic is specific to a particular nutrient, food, or the way that you eat, you could challenge it with a true statement or fact to question the inner critic. For example, if it is saying that fats are bad, you could challenge this by saying that all fats serve a purpose. They protect your heart and they store vitamins in your body. The third way is to reframe a thought. If your inner food critic is relating to a behavior or the way in which you are eating, you could shift the perspective onto something neutral or positive. So, for example, if the inner critic is saying, you shouldn't be eating, you just had dinner, you could reframe this with, I am listening to my body and I recognize that I am physically hungry, so I am going to honor that hunger and reach satisfaction. Ultimately, we rewire the brain through these three strategies. And I like to remind myself that whatever I focus on expands. So we can change how we think and behave. And these are just some examples. Now, I know this sounds all logical, and I've had some clients struggle to implement these strategies. So if you are in any doubt or resistance, let me guide you through. Our brains are smart and don't like to exert any more energy than it needs to, as it is trying to keep us alive. If 90% of our thoughts were recycled from yesterday, then being intentional can be the way to change these thought patterns with neuroplasticity. One change leads to another, so has the power to build momentum. And so if we're trying to alter our relationship with food, eating, and our bodies, it takes actions to alter both our thoughts and feelings towards foods, as well as our actions and behaviors towards foods. And so the inner food critic keeps you at war between these two things. Thank you so much for listening to this lesson. I have activities that you can start putting into practice from this module's guidebook. And remember to please like, subscribe, or share this video with others who may find it helpful.